ladies and gentlemen, we can begin our conference. It's a great honor and pleasure for me to welcome you today officially on the conference De-Materializations in Art and Art-Historical Discourse in the 20th Century. The conference is a part of the project which has a very long title, From the Material to Immaterial Medium, Changes in Art in the Second Half of the 20th Century and in the Discourse of Art History. The project is financed by the Foundation for Polish Science in the framework of the program MASTER. As the Foundation explains, the objective of this program is to support distinguished scholars by awarding them grants designed either to intensify the researches they are already conducting or to explore new fields of research. And our team consists of 5 people, except me is one postdoc, Magda Kunińska, and 3 postgraduate students, Victoria, Paweł, and Jan. And we together organized this event. The conference could be organized thanks to help and involvement of several persons and institutions. I want to mention only some of them. At first, I would like to mention our host, Mr. Ziad Rauf, the owner of this estate, who is also a representative of Kurdistan region government in Poland. Thank you also for both institutions, both universities who also organized it, Jagiellonian University and Academy of Fine Arts in Cracow. I also would like to mention a person who designed the logo of the conference. It is Szymon Tomaszewski. Now I would like to ask Professor Judyta Rodzińska-Nowak, Pro-Dean of the Vice Dean of the Faculty of History of the Jagiellonian University.
Thank you very much, Mr. Professor. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Dean of our Faculty of History of Jagiellonian University, and on my own, I would like to warmly welcome our organizers and participants of the conference, international conference, Dematerialization in Art and Art-Historical Discourse in the 20th Century. Our guests came from Poland, from other European countries, and even from the United States of America. So, welcome. The title of the conference sounds fascinating because art, material or non-material, is a great value, is often our inspiration, and is a mystery. So it's always worth talking about it. Some aspects of dematerialization are close to me because I am an archaeologist. So I wish you fruitful debates, exciting, emotional discussions, and please enjoy this beautiful place. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now I ask Professor Bogdan Achimescu, Vice Rector of the Academy of Fine Arts in Krakow, to say some words to us and then to moderate the first panel of our conference.
Thank you. First of all, I welcome and I express my gratitude for the scholars that visit us today and that will enable us to get to know a subject in depth. I'm grateful to Professor Bałus for this opportunity, and on behalf of the Fine Arts Academy in Kraków, I want to express my thanks for everyone. We are represented here also by a group of students and teachers from the intermedia department, and with them I connect my hope that this knowledge will somehow circulate between praxis and theory. When I was teaching at the art department of the University of Virginia, we were jokingly saying that there were two types of art historians, the one that are afraid to go through the ateliers and the ones that aren't. The school was hosted in a former gymnasium, and it was hard to cross from one office to another without getting paint on one's sleeves. And certainly our first guest is one that belonged to the first group that were not afraid to get paint on their sleeves. Professor David Summers, well, I have to really hold back so I don't start screaming. Professor David Summers is one of the most important art historians in the world, and I know him, but now I got it off my system. Professor David Summers is the Emeritus William R. Keenan Professor of Art Theory and Italian Renaissance at the University of Virginia. He studied art history at Brown and Yale, where he did his PhD in 1969. He's author of many important books: Michelangelo and the Language of Art, The Judgment of Sense, Renaissance, Naturalism, and the Rise of Aesthetics. More recently, Vision, Reflection, and Desire in Western Painting. And Real Spaces, World Art History and the Rise of Western Modernism, a 700-page book that crowns 20 years of research. David Summers is also an active painter and very prolific. His recent series is entitled Community Ghosts, and it represents in a visual language that's perhaps inspired by Cézanne and informed by Arab philosopher Al-Kindi. It represents humble objects, plastic bottles that we use and discards. In an interview, Professor Summers said to me, thinking is always imagining, and sometimes it turns into a painting. I think these words allow us to think about more direct ways we artists could appropriate your theoretical work. I guess, have I jumped over some phase B, and already called Professor Summers? Okay. Oh, God, I'm sorry. Okay. Okay, so this is how I repay Professor Bałus for his work. Sorry. Okay, but before we get to Professor Bałus, art historian and philosophy graduate, professor at the Institute of Art History of the Jagiellonian University of Kraków, the person to whom we have to thank for this entire moment that will be energetic. Professor Wojciech Bałus studies theory and history of art from the 19th century until today, as well as relations between art, philosophy, cultural anthropology, and literary studies. His recent book, The Effect of Visibility on Visibility, Borders, and Readability, Anthropological Aspects of Art, is focusing on the specificity of the image in both its traditional and present form, as well as on the implications of the differences between reading images and reading text. Professor Bałus is the recipient of the FNP MASTER research grant and the head of the dematerialization team. Thank you very much.
Okay, I don't know, maybe I can stay here reading my text. The term of dematerialization has made a career in the research on art of the last 50 years, thanks to Lucy Lippard, who used it for the first time in her paper Visible Art and the Invisible World, published jointly with John Chandler in Art International in 1967. More important, however, was their next paper, published in the following year, in which they tried to grasp the essence of the new art tendency called ultra-conceptual art. This tendency was described as opposing abstract expressionism in two ways. On the one hand, it is called it's called intellectualism, and on the other, by focusing not on the artwork, but on the thinking process, as I told it. As a result, painting and sculptures began to lose their importance, and artists were no longer craftsmen producing particular artifacts. The focus in art shifted from object to idea and action. There appeared conceptual sketches and descriptions, as well as performances, happenings, and objects using electronics, light, and sound. Thus, it came to dematerialization because the focus on ideas has resulted in the fact that, quote, matter is denied as sensation has been converted into concept, while in the pure action, matter has been transformed into energy and time motion, quote, end. With the abandonment of the work of art as the aim of creative process, also the main Grimbergian modernist category, that of the aesthetic form, lost its importance. In axiology, it resulted in the departure from assessing the visual qualities inherent to the composition, the color scheme, and the mutual relationship of elements within the image field. As Lippard wrote, only, quote, the beauty of an equation, formula, or solution, often referred by the mathematicians and physicists, could retain its value. The above conception was soon criticized by Terry Atkinson in a letter to Lippard, a small fragment of which she published in her books 6 years. The matter was defined as, quote, a specialized form of energy which has the attributes of mass and extension in time, and with which we become acquainted through our bodily senses, end of quotation. For the polemist, the fact that the artists restrained themselves from executing objects and could be experienced through the sense of sight did not mean dematerialization, because both the written text and the performances or films still used some form of matter. Although Atkinson's remarks were not published, everyone who ever seriously thought about the proper meaning of the word dematerialization could reach similar conclusions. If it did not happen, and Lippard's conception won popularity, there must have been a certain rationale behind it. First, the word dematerialization fulfilled an expectation to name the new processes taking place in art. Second, it apparently corresponded with widespread sentiments accompanying the departure from traditional media and genres in art. And third, it fit well the paradigm of understanding artistic phenomena and explaining changes taking place within the domain that was current at the end of the 1960s. The category of the matter and of the material, its derivate, functioned in the theory of art since antiquity. And since that time, it had been dialectically intertwined with immaterial qualities. Ovid, describing a two-leaf gate leading to the Palace of the Sun in the second book of his Metamorphoses, wrote that the craftsmanship of this work created by Vulcan, depicting lands, seas, and heavens, was far superior to the value of the precious material of which it was made. The topos of Materiam superabat opus indicated that it was not the stuff that decided about the aesthetic value of a work of art. Far more important was what the artist was able to fashion using this material. Abbot Suger instructed the viewer of the entrance to the Saint-Denis Basilica as follows: whoever thou art, if you seekest to extol the glory of these doors, marvel not at the gold and the expense, but at the craftsmanship of the work. The 20th century conception of Polish philosopher and aesthetician Roman Garden may be considered a kind of culmination of the above considerations. In Garden, in his article on the structure of the picture, distinguished the painting from the image in a narrower sense. He termed the painting to be a real thing, quotation, created on this or other material, wood, canvas, glass, etc., end of quotation, which forms the physical existential basis for a work of art. The image, in turn, was for him an intentional creation that was conjured up in the viewer's mind in the process of concretization of patches of pigment applied by the artist to the painting support. In the process of perception, the viewer started to discern the shapes of things and people, which in turn formed particular iconographic themes and were arranged according to a particular composition and color scheme. Such a procedure, however, resulted in the fact that the viewer looking at the painting, quote, at some moment of a peculiar way would forget about it, instead focusing exclusively on the image that was being constructed on top of it, end of quotation. Therefore, the material support was only a condition that was essential for a work of art to come into being, as it contained all elements, so to speak, that were programmed by the artist for its reception. However, it was not a sufficient condition, because what decided about the essence of the image was revealed in the process of concretization occurring between the material substrate and the viewer's consciousness. The contemplated work was then a kind of excess, the Ovidian surplus, and Suger's mastery, indeed based on a material support, but at the same time standing in a dialectical opposition to it. This tension is best exemplified by artworks employing the Renaissance perspective, in which the surface of the canvas or panel is material, impermeable and flat, yet perceived as if being immaterial, transparent, and three-dimensional. In European tradition, matter has always been valued lower than thought, form, or spirit. As a derivative of the materia prima, it could be a substance ready to be wrought, or as a precious metal, or it could be at best an object desired by the greedy and marveled at by the barbarians, but not the connoisseurs. This had led to a belief that it was wanted to express spiritual beauty, one should get rid of the excess of materiality. Such a way of thinking is clearly visible in the aesthetics of Hegel, who, when presenting art history of when presenting the history of art advancing towards the full autonomy of the absolute spirit, associated the beginnings of artistic creation with the excess of material with regard to the message conveyed by the works of art, as can be seen, for example, in Egyptian pyramids, symbolizing death by means of huge, heavy constructions of stone. The subsequent development of art has led to the emergence of classical balance between the matter and spirit in Greek art, and finally, to the triumph of spirituality in Romantic art. The philosopher concluded, quote, "In this way, symbolic art seeks that perfect unity of inner meaning and external shape which classical art finds in the presentation of substantial individuality to senses contemplation, and which Romantic art transcends in its superior spirituality," end of quotation. Such views were only a step away from the conviction that pure spirituality was the opposite of materiality. Conclusions of this kind appeared among the interpreters of Gothic architecture in the 19th century. Having recognized the cathedrals as embodiments of Christian longings for heavens, they interpreted the reduction of walls to the light-filled stained glass windows and the verticality of the building as a desire for relinquishing body and abandoning the temporal world. Jory Carl Huysmans wrote about Chartres, quote, "The church grew more spiritual, wholly spiritual, purely prayer, as it sprang towards the Lord to meet him. Light and slender, as it were imponderable, it remained the most glorious expression of beauty, escaping from its earthly dross." End of quotation. And he added that the edifice, quote, "was as slender and colorless as Rogier van der Weyden's virgins, who are so fragile, so ethereal, that they might blow away were they not held down to earth by the weight of their brocades and trains." End of quotation. This resulted from the fact that the cathedral embodied, quote, "the same mystical conception of a long-drawn body and an ardent soul, which, unable to free itself completely from that body, strove to purify it, but by reducing it, refining it, almost distilling it to be a fluid." End of quotation. The problem of dematerialization then appeared as a result of the above-mentioned dialectical coupling of the matter and the idea, form or spirit in European art theory. Obviously, as long as creation of art objects was deemed the unquestionable goal of artistic activity, disposing entirely of the physically existing world of art was impossible. Yet, as early as the 16th century, Federico Zuccari claimed that an artist should strive to reach the ideal of Raphael without hands, since thus the perfect ideas conceived in the mind of such an artist would not be impaired in contact with the matter. It happened so because the dialectical opposition of the matter and the idea or spirit, beauty, was still the basis for thinking about a work of art. Did the art of the 1960s and 1970s manage to go beyond the dialectical coupling of the matter, idea, and form? Sometimes around 1966, the Cracow artist Tadeusz Kantor wrote his text, "The Disappearing of the Object." Already at the beginning of the 1960s, the artist had abandoned informal painting and turned towards objects in its most basic form. He became interested in chairs, umbrellas, broken to a greater or lesser degree, as well as all kinds of old bags, sacks and envelopes. He started to create the emballage, it was his term, by gluing such artifacts to canvases or by painting wrapped up objects. In the text mentioned above, he stated that it was precisely things deprived of their usefulness on the border of being annihilated, the most profoundly manifested their objectivity, that is materiality. They revealed the reality of the lowest rank, it is his term, a kind of pure existence. Quote, an object vindicated itself through its usefulness for the price of being in a state close to annihilation and death, through a selfless process that it was submitted to. End of quotation. Yet a few years later, the artist decided that the moving to the border of the things being recognized on the verge of their decaying or disintegrating into rot of garbage did not necessarily mean revealing the pure, that is non-utilitarian objectivity of the objects of the lowest rank. An object, he wrote, quote, by losing in its importance, its physiognomy, and its existence, has seriously threatened the existence and meaning of the work of art, understood precisely as an object obviously of a certain kind, end of quotation. By gluing real things to the surface of collage technique, has sanctioned putting pieces of wallpaper or newspapers on canvases already since the beginnings of the Cubism. But what was meant in the emballage were not pieces of, but rather entire, so usually slightly damaged, man-made artifacts. Such objects were no longer inherent parts of the artwork's autonomous formal structure, but defined the short-time existence of the artist's product until the glued on back or sack disintegrated. In this way, turning the objects that were all the more material by the reality of the lowest rank status deprived of usefulness, started the process of departure from materiality of art. The until not unquestionable paradigm of perceptual existence of the once created artwork was replaced by its ontological ephemerality. Furthermore, the use of ready-made packages has led to organizing artistic actions which employed such objects. Quote, while striving to reach the full autonomy of the process of wrapping up, I come across the idea of the colossal envelope in 1967. In Warsaw, in the Vauxhall Gallery, I organized a happening entitled The Letter, in which the letter, or rather the envelope, is 14 meters long and 2 meters wide, and it carried from the post office through the city by 8 authentic postmen, end of quotation. Thus, thanks to the interest in the objects of the lowest rank, the focus has shifted from objectivity to action, quotation. This resulted in ephemeral artworks that lasted only for a certain short time, were passing and concretized their expression and form merely in a contained time period, that were a process and not a materialization. End of quotation. Focusing on objects of the lowest rank, putting them on the canvas and including them in happenings, has also led, according to Cantor, to the conceptualization of art, quotation, a work of art by losing its objective qualities and the kind of reception of an aesthetic value associated with them, has located its value in the sphere of thought in which the relationships, references, affinities, and confirmations function, end of quotation. Paintings or sculptures ceased to be, as he claimed, the point of artistic focus, that is creation that, thanks to the Ingardenian process of concretization, activated as ecstatic experience. An object, the artist continued, is, quotation, rather a prop, so remote from the notion we have of a work of art, and whose presence is so ill-founded in the place usually and conventionally reserved for a work of art, that it forces one to search for its actual, not in non-material, that is non-material meaning, purpose and function in the sphere of thought, end of quotation. Cantor's text confirmed Lippard's observation that the new art was interested not that much in artistic artifacts, but in the ideas and actions. Simultaneously, he made a significant shift of emphasis in his argumentation. He did not use the term of dematerialization, but spoke about the gradual disappearance of the art of the object, or in being treated as a prop. This that disappears does not necessarily have to be dematerialized. It may simply become redundant or accidental and go out of use. If, however, an object starts to function exclusively as a probe, this means that the entire hitherto existing relationship between the Gardenian material painting support and the image as intellectual creation has been annihilated. The object no longer has to be reconstructed on the basis of a layer of pigments. The traditional work of art was destroyed not by the dematerialization, but by something precisely opposite to it, by the materialization, that is, an introduction into art of the reality of the lowest rank, meaning all kinds of various ready-mades. Their emergence deprived the formula of materiam superabat opus of its meaning, because the artist was no longer fashioning human figures, history, sense, or some configurations of beautiful forms with his brush or chisel, nor was he displaying the virtuosity of the craftsmanship. The attraction to useless, old-fashioned, wrecked, or redundant objects resulted in the focus in art having shifted from the masterful form, aesthetic expression and quality to conceptual work in the sphere of things, to research for meaning. According to Jacob Lilmo's quote, instead of understanding dematerialization as a negation or dismissal of materiality as such, it can be comprehended as an extensive and fundamental rethinking of the multiplicity of materiality beyond its connection to the entire entity of the object, end of quotation. It has been claimed that the material support of work of art lost its reason for being in digital art because what appears on computer screens are only simulations. They do not have haptic qualities and consequently cease to be tangible in Gardenian paintings. However, as observed by Jean-François Lyotard, quote, the code itself is inscribed in the support as an orderly distribution of the discrete elements which constitute the material, electronic waves, sound waves, light, and so on. End of quotation. Thus, the material does not disappear entirely, but only ceases to exist as independent entity, that is, as a self-reliant substance opposed to form that used to be the essence of the traditional paintings and sculptures. The material is brought down to numerical codes. In his letter, Atkinson defined matter as a specialized form of energy which has the attributes of mass and extension in time. But already classical physics eliminated the notion of matter from its scientific apparatus. It used exclusively the category of mass, which was sometimes mistaken for matter. Contemporary physics has gone still further. I quote a Polish astrophysic and philosopher, Michał Heller. All its models of reality are mathematical models. There is nothing apart from the shape, structure, and purely formal scheme in them. The function of the experiment, in fact, consists only in identifying such formal structures that cannot be models of the world. It comes to mind that the substance the world is made of is nothing else but information. End of quotation. The notion of matter matched well the traditional art, with artworks executed of marble on canvas or on the wall of the building. There it had been associated with the intentional object that was conceived by the observer in the process of viewing. The changes that occurred in the art after the mid-20th century, owing to the emergence of the digital world, may be compared to contemporary physics in its regard that art started to create certain schemes that eluded description in the material categories. According to Jacques Derrida, the materialization, quote, tends towards the effacement of exteriority, end of quotation. The advent of the digital code for recording data eliminated the duality of external matter and internal form, the dialectical tangle of the material that has to be wrought up upon and of the workmanship. Everything became the McLuhanian information. Yet, sometimes the digital system fails. In such a case, unintelligible strings of characters instead of image or text appear on the computer screen or printed pages. In this, a form of manifestation of the is this a form of manifestation of the materia prima? It is certainly not. The instance of the disobedience of computers merely show that every human creation is based on some media put together from purposeful wholes. Niklas Luhmann called media as, quote, loosely coupled elements. According to the German sociologist, they are made up of elements or in a temporal aspect of events, but these elements are only very loosely connected. Quote, loose coupling, which leaves from the multiple combinations, can be understood in both a factual and a temporal sense. Factually, it means that a number of tight couplings are likely and selection is inevitable. Temporally speaking, a medium is often understood as a condition for transfer, end of quotation. Everything can be a medium: air, painting, support, body, a sheet of paper, script, electronic waves. These loosely coupled factors may be combined into something that Luhmann calls a form, that is the tightly packed relationship between them. The disintegration of the whole reveals the essence of the media alone, which, as a loose coupling of elements, may be meaningless or convey an unintelligible message, as in the case of digital codes appearing on the computer screen instead of images or texts. The notion of the medium allows for moving beyond the category of the matter. A work of art does not necessarily have to be made of the material in the sense of Greek hyle, but at the same time it requires, as Hans Belting demonstrated, some kinds of body in order to come into being at all. Digital art is immaterial, but it creates an image by means of the medium of the digital codes. Lucy Lippard introduced the category of dematerialization in order to describe the changes in the attitude toward a work of art that were taking place before her eyes. Once the center of the artist's attention has shifted from paintings and sculptures to process and action, Cantor made a huge envelope, but he also introduced postmen, the space of a post office, street of Warsaw, and rooms of the Vauxhall Gallery into his action. All these human, special, and objective factors became media combined into one performative whole. The notion of dematerialization shows then that with the bordering of the scope of media used, the category of matter become analytically redundant in considerations on art, just like in the case of physics, where it lost its operational value. Material objects ceased to be elements from which the existential substance of artworks was constructed, becoming at best one of many components of artistic actions understood as a process, idea, or digital code. And yet the matter has not disappeared from the domain of art. Since some years, Sterling Crispin has shown his data masks. The artists use face recognition and face detection algorithms to create human-like faces, which he can print in 3D technique. Such actions are often explained as motivated by the pressure of economical factors in the contemporary capitalist world, with the traditional principle ruling the art market, which impose on the artist the use of material artifacts that function as commodities. The economical aspect of such practices is also confirmed by the opposite tendencies, where the artists don't make artworks because they have not enough money to do it. Yet the problem of neo-materiality of contemporary computer art does not end here. Already Lyotard, in the exhibition Les Immatériaux, wanted to show that digital technologies lead to a disintegration of man's human identity and to a peculiar form of the death of the author. Typically human attributes, as I quote, experience, memory, work, autonomy or liberty, even creation, end of quotation, are gradually becoming those of the machine. As a result, a computer and not a flesh and blood artist may be the author of the creation of the artwork. Crispin's data masks demonstrate how such an electronic creative process functions. What we get is a tangible image of a human face reconstructed by software. This image is entirely inhuman because, although it identifies specific parts of the head, it is incapable of rendering the gaze, the very feature that has always been the essence of the vera effigies, that is, the sight, does not count here. Computer recognizes singular features of a given person without looking into her eyes. Yet it is a paradox that information about the inhuman character of this man-made machine is delivered by an object that would traditionally be called material. Should we then assume that matter, having been rejected as a synonymous with material, without which no image could once come into existence, has now returned in a peculiar form as a mirror of humanity? And I end with this question. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Bałus. There will be time for discussion after the next lecture. I'm wondering whether we should check what's happening with the sound system. Is it a cable or something? And meanwhile, since I messed up at the beginning, I guess I don't have to introduce Professor Summers anymore.
Well, as Bogdan said, I need no introduction, and I can begin. I'm very glad to be here in Cracow, where I've never been, and my wife has never been, and we've enjoyed our time very much. I have always meant to visit Bogdan, and the opportunity presented itself. together with this conference, and here I am, and here we are. In this short paper, I'm going to argue that the status of material has changed in the modern period because matter, which in the long tradition was absolutely passive, has gradually proven itself to be very active indeed. Moreover, this deep and general historical change is especially important for art and artists and for the history of art and artists because, as we shall see, the intellectual idea, or rather the traditional idea of matter, was closely based on the analogy to art making, and when matter itself comes to be regarded as an active principle, the relation of art making to matter changed accordingly. The idea of matter was a foundational idea from which other foundational ideas have branched, and its substantial changes in the modern period are equally foundational. As I have just said, in the long tradition, matter was passive, pure potentiality, necessary substratum, awaiting form, and utterly subordinate to form. The traditional idea of form is fairly complex, but we still talk about making something out of something else. And in the long tradition, however, this intuitive, common sense, and deeply anthropomorphic notion about making things was much expanded to explain how things taken all together come into existence, both in art and in nature. In the long tradition, which I'm going to be not entirely, but largely concerned in this paper, matter, although of course absolutely necessary, was also absolutely negative in two senses. Its passivity meant that material had no qualities of its own, it was not intelligible as forms were, and it was divisible. Forms returned to matter. Matter was also negative in that it was resistant to form. All of this is opposed to the very fundamental and characteristic and modern idea that matter is active. We now assume the unfathomably great universe to be made up to its farthest extent of the particles and forces that constitute ourselves and the world in which we live. There are now many more elements than earth, water, air, and fire. Some elements are unstable, even radioactive, and E equals mc squared, even though the m is debatable, where m, according to a certain view, is matter, and c is the speed of light. Matter is energy, and the energy concentrated in matter is stupendous. Where did the idea of matter come from? Important changes take place when everyday words become philosophical terms. The Greek term for matter was hyle, which first meant the wood out of which something might be made. In its philosophical understanding, this was much generalized to become whatever is made into something else or is given form, an idea that, as we shall see, was similarly generalized. Wood, gold, silver, bronze, marble, clay, all were matter, and whatever actually exists is matter that has been formed. Anything that has actually come to be presupposes something from which it could be made, and whatever that might actually have been, it was matter. At the same time that matter became everything out of which anything might be made, it of course also lost all the qualities of any specific material, which is another way of saying that it is absolutely passive and in fact may hardly be said to exist. Passive matter was opposed to the active principle of form, which was not only a principle of definiteness or definition and unity, but a principle of function, of suitability to the activities of life, whatever they happen to be. Form was absolutely positive, active, and unified. I have the form I do in order to do what a human being does. Form was thus also teleological. It defined shape, but also growth, the achievement of maturity, completion in reproduction and decline. Form was final cause in the old dispensation, the good toward which everything that comes to be and passes away like sticky paper must move. The Greek word for form was morphe, and still in philosophical terms, hylomorphism is the idea that all things are unions of matter and form. Aristotle argued that both matter and form only exist in their unions, which he called entelechy, that is, matter given a telos, an end or purpose by form. I have already mentioned that human art, which gives form to matter, was the model for all such natural processes, and I cannot overstress the literalness of this analogy. Aristotle, followed by countless others to early modern times, wrote in his Physics that if nature were to build a house, it would be built as a good architect builds it. And if an architect were to make a tree, it would be made as nature makes a tree. That is, nature is like a skilled craftsperson. Both art and nature gave form to matter, and in fact, Aristotle says, the only real difference between the two is that in the case of art, the form is in the artist's mind, whereas in the case of nature, the form is in the thing itself. The tiny acorn contains the form that becomes a great oak. The zygote contains the form that becomes an adult and then an old person. In short, a living thing fulfills its nature, its telos, in an orderly way as it comes to be and passes out of existence. Both art and nature proceed in orderly and skillful ways. In these terms, the soul is the form of the body, which again in the long tradition assumes the form it does in order to enact the soul's wills or intention. Matter was not only passive and divisible, it was also inert, a word that actively incorporates art. Again, this means that matter has no skill or power. It can't do anything and awaits active form. As might be expected, and as we shall see, from the very beginnings of Greek thought, matter was gendered, deeply gendered, as female. This is not only the case in Latin, it is still current. Matter is from material, which is from mother, related to matrix, womb, and matron. This all acknowledges that matter is indispensable, as all of those things are, but only as a necessary condition, a material cause. No bronze, no statue. The bronze, however, could be bad, and in general, matter could, as I said, resist form, and so could explain deficiency and deformity of all kinds. As is well known for Plato, actual things were more or less imperfect images of invisible ideal forms in the world of the good, beautiful, and true, a higher world forgotten by the soul as it fell into the lower world. In ancient Neoplatonism, the hierarchical, in ancient Neoplatonism, equivalent of early Christian, the hierarchical difference between form and matter became vast. The one was at the top, ideas or forms were set in and by the divine mind. In the middle, nature realized these ideas of form, and at the bottom was matter, not as absolute evil, but as the lowest of creation. And the question of its creation, of course, was very difficult because anything that related to it contaminated it. As the Renaissance Neoplatonist Marsilio Ficino wrote, nothing evil or ugly comes close at all to the highest goodness and beauty, but many evil and ugly things occur in the proximity of matter. If God is being itself, he cannot be the form of matter. God acts through forms, not through matter. God and body, Ficino says, are the extremes of nature and completely different from one another. I am citing these words because they are more or less typical of writers through the centuries, not because they are personal to Ficino. For Aristotle, as I shall discuss at greater length, things were more concrete than they were for Plato. But for centuries, artists tried either to find the beautiful in their work or to achieve beauty through the study of works deemed beautiful. Both Platonic ideas and Aristotelian forms wanted to be perfectly embodied in natural forms, but matter might resist to one degree or another. Beauty was often explained in terms of correspondence to these forms, and ugliness was explained by non-correspondence to them, which had the additional fault of being deviation from both the functional and the intelligible. In this sense, beauty was close to truth. In the long tradition, then, matter was a principle of imperfection, and because matter was close to sensation, matter might also be seen as a principle of particularity. Where am I here? Although this was not the tack usually taken. In any case, it is not hard to see that these millennial ideas are very closely related to what art was long considered to be, namely a mental form or idea that is realized or expressed in matter to become a work. Let me see now. What we're looking at here is a very vivid visual example. These are fossils, as you see. They're some kind of mollusks, and I'm showing them to you to give you a very clear notion of what the relationship between form and matter was. In the old world, in the pre-modern world, when people found things like this, they explained them by saying that nature had tried to make something out of the wrong material. So that if you're walking along a mountain path and you come across a seashell, like the ones that we see here, what you'd say is that nature had, this was some kind of sport of nature. Leonardo, actually, speaking of painters, was one of the first to suspect that mountains must have been at the bottom of the sea at a certain point, as we now understand to be the case. There is an old joke about form and matter, according to which an elephant, which you see here on the left, this is a fourth century Indian elephant chosen at random, is carved by getting a block of stone and cutting off everything that doesn't look like an elephant. Michelangelo's famous sonnet, Non all'ottimo artista alcun concetto, seems to follow this pattern, and begins with the statement that the excellent artist, you recognize Michelangelo's St. Matthew on the right, has no concept that is not circumscribed in a block of stone, and this concept is realized by the hand that obeys the intellect. Michelangelo concludes, however, that because he loves imperfectly, he is not the excellent artist. He cannot achieve his concetto, and therefore can never achieve the revelation of his concept. This is a wrinkle on the traditional Platonic theme, but it does not deviate in the essential respect that matter is still passive. And were he the perfect lover, the stone would be the vehicle of his expression. There is, however, an especially interesting feature of this poem, the use of the word concetto, concept. It is the equivalent of the form in the artist's mind, but it is not strictly mental. The artist's mind is now a matrix from which forms are born. This basic metaphor is biological, and as we might still speak of a fertile imagination. How did form come to be associated with mind, and matter with body and sense? As I have mentioned, matter was divisible, and divisibility was another feature of this passivity. This was again opposed to the essential wholeness of forms. Platonic ideas, idea is from eido, again to see, although these ideas are to be seen with the mind's eye. Platon's ideas are not very seen. We both sense and think things to be mental, and to be mental is to be abstract, in the literal sense of having been drawn from something. The words abstraction, by the way, and drawing are very close to one another etymologically. The first abstraction is sensation itself in the long tradition, which is the abstraction of form from matter. Aristotle compared sensation to the impression of a signet ring in wax. The ring leaves its impression in the wax, but retains its own matter. The transmission of forms to the eye itself meant that form could be separated from matter. Aristotle defined the soul as the form of forms, meaning that the human rational soul, as the form of the human body, is able to apprehend these abstracted forms and to think further about them and do other things with them, remember them, imagine them, and so forth. With his customary forthrightness, he concludes that the form of the stone and not the stone is in the mind. Thank heaven. And the intermediary is the eye. The word pupil, one of which you see here on the left, a modern surrealist pupil. The word pupil now has a precise anatomical definition: the apparently black opening through which the light enters the eye. The word pupil, however, is from the Latin pupilla, which means something like little doll. The Greeks called the pupil of the eye the chore, or maiden, and you see a maiden there on the right. Both referred to a little reflected form on the surface of the eye. Some argued that this reflection was in fact the act of vision. Democritus apparently made this claim, and Aristotle said that he couldn't explain why everything that's shiny is not an eye. The maiden or doll is abstracted from the object of vision, but it is also tiny and isolated, and it is abstracted a second time from the whole field of vision. Since Johannes Kepler in the 17th century, we are used to thinking of vision not in terms of seeing individual forms, but in terms of the retina at the back of the eye. We thus have a landscape painterly notion of vision. By way of contrast, the little doll from antiquity is an isolated figure or form, like a statue, but tiny. The small image on or in the eye not only leaves the matter of its origin behind, it retains the form of its origin as it is abstracted from its size. It retains its proportions. This raises the issue of ratio or ratio, which has to do with numerical relations apart from measure, and therefore apart from matter. Ratios 1 to 2, to take a simple example, are therefore mental, like form. Ratio is from reor, ratus, to reckon or calculate, and of course it may also be translated as reason, which might be defined as the capacity to perform operations with mental relations. The association of form with mind was also hierarchical, mind over matter. I have mentioned in passing that the idea of matter was deeply gendered, and although it is clear that this is a major factor in the history I am outlining, it has never been clear to me just how deeply important this might be. I wrote an article about this called Form and Gender, which was published here and there, and I think that this is much deeper than most intellectual historians historical issues. The status of women in Aristotle's philosophy could hardly be worse as we now understand the same issues, and far from being forgotten or supplanted, his ideas survived with various modifications for well over 2,000 years. According to Aristotle, who again was authoritative into the early modern period, there were 5 elements in the universe: earth, water, air, fire, and ether, or quintessence. Women were associated with earth and water, and were therefore colder. Men were associated with air and fire, and with quintessence, and were therefore hotter. Male heat made blood into semen, which women as colder could not do, hence menstruation. Semen is associated with the 5th heavenly element. Moreover, nature always intended to make males, but matter resisted, and the first deviation from this intention was the female. Here is Aristotle on human conception, and this is a very remarkable mechanism that he's describing. It is essentially important that this process is again described in close analogy to art. That is, conception is not an intrinsically natural process. Rather, it is an intrinsically artificial process, even though it is natural. To be sure, it might be acknowledged that the works of nature were more complex than those of art, but as we have seen, they were not in principle different from other works of art. The common terms are still orderly procedure and skill. In a laborious argument, Aristotle attempts to show that there are only 2 factors, form and matter, and that semen is the tool and skill that brings the first into existence in the second. Nothing passes, now here's the process. Nothing passes from the carpenter into the pieces of timber, which are his material, and there is no part of the art of carpentry present in the object which is being fashioned. It is the shape and form which pass from the carpenter, and they come into being by means of the movement of the material, highly. It is his soul, wherein is the form, and his knowledge, which causes his hands or some other part of his body to move in a particular way, different ways for different products, and always the same way for any one product. His hands move the tools, and his tools move the material. At this point in Aristotle's account, nature enters the argument. In a similar way to this, nature, acting in the male of semen-emitting animals, uses the semen as a tool, as something that has movement in actuality, just as when objects are being produced by any art, the tools are in movement because the movement which belongs to art is, in a way, situated in them. The artist's tool and skill in its use is a neutral agent, a means of transforming form to matter, and so for nature. Moreover, semen is active, a principle of movement that galvanizes the passive female to the activity of reproduction. The idea of form, and therefore of matter, and the conception of art that went with it, was profoundly anthropomorphic, in that the works of nature, understood in the most general sense, were considered to be like human works, much as the gods were assumed to have human form and human will and emotions. One of the foundations of modern natural science was the rejection of anthropomorphism. Here is Francis Bacon stating one of the first and continuing principles of modern Western science. In his Novum Organum Scientiarum, he wrote that the school of Democritus had proved, these are the atomists, had probed best into the secrets of nature, and that, quote, matter rather than Aristotle's forms, he's still arguing with Aristotle here in 1620, should be the object of our attention, its configurations and changes of configurations and simple action and laws of action or motion. For forms, he says, are figments of the human mind, unless you will call those laws of action forms. The revolutionary nature of this statement can hardly be underlined too many times. Probing the secrets of nature raises its own questions of gender, of course, but since nature was always female. But then these secrets were powerful and, if problematic, also beneficial. Natural forms were to be seen, Bacon is saying, as clusters of efficient causes, causes with immediate effects, working according to the laws, yielding what Aristotle had mistakenly called forms. Bacon thus dismissed formal and final causes, that is, the foundation of pre-modern physics, the whole way of understanding the world and how it works, as clusters of wait a minute, where am I? I waved my arms one too many times. Natural forms were to be seen, Bacon is saying, as clusters of efficient causes, causes with immediate effects, working according to the laws, yielding what Aristotle mistakenly called forms. Bacon thus dismissed formal and final causes, that is, the foundation of pre-modern physics, as idols of the tribe, awaiting demolition in his great Instauration, in which the newly disciplined human intellect would stray no farther from the facts of nature than, he says, may suffice to let the images and rays of natural objects meet in a point as they do in the sense of vision. The idols of the tribe, he says, take their rise, and this will become a theme in writers after him, either from the homogeneity of the substance of the human spirit, or from its preoccupation, or from its narrowness, or from its restless motion, or from an infusion of affections, or from the incompetency of the senses, or from the mode of impression. Somehow the idea of form has to be explained away. The real material world is made up of still to be discovered processes that can be analyzed, quantified, then artificially recapitulated and manipulated. Newton did not define what gravity was, he defined what it does and how its actions might be controlled and turned to use, and so the modern world was built. The changes I have illustrated with Bacon's words is crucial because it bears immediately upon the question of matter, the workings of which are not imposed by form, but internal and lawful. As I have said, final cause or form, the principle of imposition upon matter, was another fundamental casualty of the rise of modern science. The range, or rather the change that formal to efficient cause was far from a mere conceptual change. Rather, it was far from a mere conceptual change. Rather, it became the practicable basis for the emergence of the modern Western world of natural resources, energy, and industry. Heat from burning coal makes water boil. The steam drives the machines which weave the textiles, which fuel the ships, which fuel the economy. The unbinding of matter was a slow but relentless process. Here is another example of the translation of empirical into philosophical language. In the early 17th century, it was noted that if acid or cold is applied to human tissue, to a corpse, the tissue of a corpse, the tissue reacts. This phenomenon was called irritability and was immediately understood to mean that the body was not simply matter. This is the conclusion that was drawn right away. The body is not simply matter, subject to soul or will, but rather has its own energies and could act independently of will and soul. This gave rise to a major school of materialist vitalism that competed in medical theory with Cartesian mechanism through the 18th century. In the early 19th century, the philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, who had medical training, based his metaphysics on this theory of irritability. For Schopenhauer, irritability and sensibility were indications of a deep universal energy in things, which he called the will. Our actions are not strivings of the ego, but actions of the will. Apprehended from without, irritability, he says, is a qualitas occulta, like gravity, and only self-consciousness reveals it as the will. In the causal chain, this is still Schopenhauer, from the impression of the motive lying outside to the contraction of the muscle, the will does not in some way come in as the last link in the chain, but in the metaphysical substratum of the irritability of the muscle. So the muscle moves and then we think, basically is what he's arguing. We mistakenly perceive our actions as our own will, but irritability is the chink through which a vast underlying force may be glimpsed, impersonal and pre-rational, bent on the survival of life and species, relative to which intellect is secondary. The will, he says, is something original and metaphysical. The intellect, that is for Schopenhauer, the activity of the brain as a physical organ, is like all things physical, subject to inertia. Freud would later acknowledge Schopenhauer as a precursor who, with his half-philosophical, half-literary critical writing, was certainly the most influential pessimist before Freud. His philosophical commentary on then-current physiology looks immediately forward to the emergence of the unconscious, a reality we all take for granted. Matter is not only alive, it is alive in ways that are deeper than consciousness. At the same level of generality, evolution meant that the material world was and is constantly changing at a level deeper than form, or that changes in form are dependent upon changes at the level of what had been matter. Dependence of form on environment meant response at an invisible level. An organism that adapts to the cold does not do so simply by changing shape, but by undergoing internal changes together with changes of shape. To return to the question of gender, William Harvey, who first described the circulation of blood in 1628, also advanced the hypothesis that all mammals were born from eggs. Microscopy was not in sufficient state of development to decide the matter, and Harvey's idea was resisted in favor of the explanation that sperm contained the tiny form of a person, a homunculus, that grew in the womb, the female still, according to Aristotle, supplying the material from which the homunculus grew. This is clearly a close variant of the ancient Aristotelian scheme. Mammalian eggs were not observed until the 19th century, and human eggs were not observed until the 20th century. Equality or symmetry in conception was thus achieved very late, although, of course, equality in gestation was not. Conception, this absolute foundation of human nature, cannot be explained in terms of active form and passive matter, nor can it be explained in analogy to art, unless we think of art differently. To return to the question of art, the old scholastics made a distinction between what they called natura naturans and natura naturata. Natura naturans is nature naturing, nature doing what nature does, acting in an orderly way to bring things into existence, acting according to form. Natura naturata is nature having done what nature does. Nature at hand, what nature has made, the nature we feel and see. Given this distinction, imitation could take two forms. The imitation of natura naturata is the imitation of appearances, whereas the imitation of natura naturans is the imitation of the processes by which nature works, rational behavior toward an end, as Aristotle said. It is perhaps the fundamental commonplace about Western modernism that artists gave up the imitation of appearances, or in these old scholastic terms, gave up the imitation of natura naturata. There is perhaps some continuity with the imitation of process, however, and of newly understood processes, the secrets of nature. Impressionism, for example, might be seen not so much as the imitation of appearances as the imitation of the processes of visual perception, and more specifically, of retinal perception. Symbolism and expressionism might be seen as the imitation of neurological and emotional responses to sensation, or surrealism as the imitation of processes of unconscious fixation and association. In the case of Impressionism and Expressionism, which are not represented here, I'll get to them in a minute, as subject matter receded in importance, as haystacks replaced nymphs and satyrs. That's what you're seeing here, the replacement of nymphs and satyrs by haystacks. The actual means of representation became much more material. The imitation of appearances involved the radical transformation of materials. Not only did the pigments in a medium that were used to make a painting not look like pigments in a medium, they might look like a nymph or satyr or anything else. In that respect, paint is like the old definition of matter, and such transformation became increasingly problematical. In real spaces, which you heard about earlier in my introduction, I argued that 19th century realism in the age of photography raised a kind of paradox in that the event of making a painting of a contemporary event, which is what realism did, was increasingly understood to be a unique spatio-temporal event in its own right. Both are events, in which case the painter is understood to be acting among the materials of painting, and the painting is a consequence of those actions. In such cases, materiality can only be acknowledged in paint and evident facture. Without knowing much about them, I have always been sort of hypnotized by Courbet's paintings of the source of the Lou, which he did, the kind of painting he did several times. Here, in these paintings, are two fundamental elements of the long tradition, earth and water, in dark interaction, bursting into the light, which is the sight of painter and viewer. At the same time, the painting is a parody of perspective and of that kind of denial of real surface that we heard about in the last paper. A cancellation of vision and of the geometry of light, which falls inexorably back into black. Here, this is the third of these, and on the right, kind of hard to see here, but this is Robert Morris thinking about Courbet, and he's taken a detail from one of these paintings of Courbet's, and he's sort of transmogrifying it. It's already perspective and chiaroscuro and everything on the brink, and he has made it into, you can't really see it here, but he's made it into cubes, as if it were an electronic image, as if it were a reproduction, which is hardly legible, actually, through its representation. Truth to materials. Now, this is very truth to materials is a principle of Western artistic modernism, from Brancusi's, I thought I had a bird, but those aren't birds, to Frank Stella's paint as good as it was in the can. The modern world is one in which there is much at hand, which is already made, and this constitutes another kind of material, as we recognize that the modern world is very different, just in the amount of stuff that we have around us, which can be material. And in this final paragraph context, in this context, the delicate new medium of collage announces a fundamental principle by using materials of a kind that did not exist in the earlier tradition. These new materials continued to be acknowledged. They're not transformed. They continue to be acknowledged and their character preserved. Deeper, however, was the rejection of the assumption that works of art were made of a single material, the imposition of form on whatever material it was, a survivor of the tradition of form. What emerged at the same time was form understood in different terms, in basically aesthetic terms, in terms of arrangement, in terms of gathering and arrangement, and that's the end of the paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There's now time for questions, and in half an hour we have a coffee break before the second half of the day. So if anyone wants, can I pass you the mic? Well, I think it's going to degenerate in discussion pretty soon. But we are recording it to the mic.
Okay. Okay. Thank you for this talk, which raises quite a lot of issues. I was just thinking a little bit about the genealogy here of form versus matter that you presented to us, and for a moment there I thought you were going to describe Courbet's source painting as the anti-Plato's cave, looking into the other direction. But of course there's also this theme you brought up of earth or stone and water, to avoid the gender implications right now. So there's also here a theme of actually animated and inanimate matter. It seems to me that another way of thinking about this genealogy that you presented is actually attempt to discover where and when matter becomes live. When does matter become animate? And thinking from the present, I think there are two very important moments that could be maybe factored into this, which is the discovery of the virus as of course an important metaphor for us today. While we're still under attack, I think, by a worldwide global virus. That's one thing. And the other moment when there's this confusion, but also the sense that maybe we discovered exactly where the boundary between life, living matter and non-living matter exists, is the discovery in the end of the, towards the end of the 19th century, although there's some earlier moments in which this was discussed, liquid crystals. Liquid crystal, of course, now becoming a major technology. So if we would, move beyond cubism into the present, ask where this form / matter division, how that continues, then maybe those would be possible ways of building that bridge into the present. So through the viral and the liquid crystal. I don't know if you can comment on that at all, or.
I don't, as I sit here, I don't know when viruses were identified. They're still talking about an early stage. People I was quoting, an early stage in microscopy, and they know about bacteria and things that live in the water, and things like that. Well, I truly don't know when viruses were discovered. Somebody could maybe tell me that. Crystals have a very interesting. Does anybody know when viruses were? Bogdan, help me. Let me see. One thing I was going to say was that there were that I cut out of this in order to make the length that it is, but there were always theories of vitalism. So that Plato's world is a zoon. It's an animal. It's a living thing, and it's not just a musical harmony. It's a living thing, and this kind of globalization of the life of the world is always kind of lurking in the background, and the appearance of these examples, like irritability and like bacteria. I mean, they had an enormous impact. But crystals, in what's his name? I'm sorry? 1890s. Yeah. So
at the same time that liquid crystals were exhaustively being described.
Yeah. Well, people were very interested in crystals even earlier than the 19th century because they seemed to be a spontaneous formation that stopped short of life. So they verged on the living, and so the processes of their formation. Even Kant was interested in this. He described watching the ice crystals forming on a window, and how this kind of hexagonal order appears and appears and appears, and then assumes other forms. And the abstraction and empathy person, Boehringer, yeah, Wilhelm Boehringer. One of his categories is the crystalline. He actually characterizes the modern as the crystalline, and he opposes this to the empathic or organic, but he associates it with a kind of death wish, actually, and a kind of return to from life to the state of the crystalline, of the near living, and so somehow I think the sort of iconography of the crystal, or iconology of the crystal, would be a very, very interesting thing to sort of nail down. Schopenhauer was also interested in crystals, and I think in the in the whole historical process of thinking about the physical process, that this would be something that could be thought about with good results.
Well, I wanted to switch to something else, so I don't know whether it was, no? This is just a remark to the notion of the truth of material. In German, you have the very long discourse. It's called Materialgerechtigkeit. It's a slightly different notion, but it maybe is your argument. Maybe I didn't quite understand, but as far as I did my research on this concept, it was strongly conservative and being against all the new developments and new inventions of new material, of the plastic materials and so on. And it was a sort of, until the Bauhaus, it was a concept to keep those new developments away, which were based on what you explained as the exchange of atome, or whatever you might call it, not on the form level. And Ruskin, who invented that notion in the English language, was strictly, he strictly bound that to very traditional natural materials, and so did all the Central European authors who tried to preserve a very old-fashioned or a very traditional concept of material. I just wanted to add that. And a second notion to the Courbet, as I think it was Klaus Herding or maybe another scholar, Timothy Clark on Courbet, they analogized this origin of the loop with the very similar composition of the one of the woman, which was painted by Courbet, and so the gender notion, of course, is enforced.
Yeah, well, that of course is part. I basically find it difficult not to make that comparison, and also I find it difficult not to see the very great historical importance of the comparison and exactly the issue of the issue of the nature of matter with respect to forming vision is very much at issue. As for the earlier part about, I mean, you know, intellectual history moves, as the term was used in the last paper, I didn't use it, but you know, dialectically, there are conservatives and then there are people who say, well, we should be embracing modern materials. We should be building the Eiffel Tower and things that that go up higher and higher, and things that are made possible by new materials, and that, so to speak, display them. So, you know, and materials gather kinds of significance. The local importance of materials is a deeply conservative notion that your people make these buildings out of these, you know, these materials. So it's you know, going back to what really, in general terms, is an earlier idea of the transformation of materials, you know, that's another way of describing the sort of conservatism that you're talking about. But it's also right on the verge. You just need to twist the knob a little bit, and you've got the counter measure of the assertion of the modern in new materials, I would say.
Yes, I think it would be better if your paper was earlier as mine, because it was much deeper and fundamental with the definition of the matter. I have two questions or two statements. The first one is connected with the problem of Materialgerechtigkeit. This was concerned with the problem of the architecture of the 19th century, where new the materials like plaster or something else was used like instead of real marble or stone, and it was Ruskin who connected this problem with the true in the architecture. The good true architecture is the architecture which uses good materials and which does not make fakes like the sculpted elements which are done not from stone and so on. The other problem is you said that matter is what we can see. This connection between sight and matter is very important, but my question is what about the tactile values of matter, because also for us matter is something what we can touch. It is also, I think, a very important problem. Thank you.
There was always a lot of trouble talking about matter because in a way it didn't exist. It was what had to be there in order for all kinds of other things to happen. It had no qualities of its own. It had no skills of its own. As I said, it had no qualities. Qualities were in the old. Is that me? No. Hmm? It's a pure matter. Pure matter. Yes, that's right. It's matter resisting my trying to say what I'm saying. Yeah. I was talking about quality, and quality in the pre-modern. Quality is a very pre-modern idea, by the way, and quality were the features in terms of which something acted. So a red apple has the quality of redness, and we see red as a result of the activity of the quality of the redness of the apple. But this already quality was above the level of matter. I mean, even the kind of least sensible characteristics of things could not be explained in material terms. Quality and sensation, however, were close. They were very close in the same way that sensation was close to matter and always considered immediate to matter. I think that the idea of tactility, that's something else that could be that's a very deep question. I'm thinking of say it's already in the early 18th century that George Berkeley, in his new theory of vision, talks about he's arguing that we don't just the eye itself as the earlier tradition argued. The eye itself does not make judgments of distance. That instead we learn the ideas through touch and vision together, and which kind of looks back to the old Paragoni dispute and all that, and the truth of tangibility in that case, as opposed to the Aristotle. I have Aristotle in my mind, I guess, because I just read this paper, but he thought it was possible that all of the senses could be reduced to touch. And people writing about modern optics, once in the 14th century, they had Alhazen's theory of light. They basically could talk about sight as a kind of touch, and that they could explain, at least in principle, the nature of the physical contact affected by light. between my eye or your eye and the surfaces that you're looking at. And so in that case, which I think became much more the kind of dominant modern view, the distinction between sight and touch is not hard. I don't think that's an answer to your question, but I think the answer to your question would be that we should think more about this issue of the issue between sight and touch, and matter and touch. Something that I didn't quote. I left a paragraph out of this, and it was Immanuel Kant giving a kind of short version of his critique of pure reason, and he says that sensation is matter and mind is form. So we are forming the world as we experience the world, and sensation is what's given to us as the beginning of that process, and that raises the relationship of sensation to consciousness and to the means of consciousness. Eyes, ears.
I would like to thank you for your two talks, and I have to say that personally I was most delighted that there were those resistances of matter, because actually I do believe that the materialization that occurred in 1960s was deeply connected to the experimental music, and the changes in the notion of the matter are deeply connected to the rise of modern physics that changed the relation between sound and matter. That's the ancient relation that would be characterized as a musica mundi, which still resonated in 17th century in writings and beautiful graphs, for example, by Robert Flad and Athanasius Kirchner. And then in the second half of the 18th century, we see an unparalleled expansion of modern mathematics and the rise of modern physics. And then in the 19th century, we can see completely different discourse. For example, around the technical problems of the acoustics of the new sirens, and the first real attempts to synthesize speech, and so on and so on. And actually, it corresponds really well to the importance of the energy of this energetic discourse that was so greatly described by Anton Rabinbach in his book 20 years ago. I think there's a deep connection between the rise of the modern physics and its discourse and this discourse about energy. And I deeply believe that these are two parallel discourses that very slowly and for a long time outside the realms of music and visual arts shaped a different mass approach to the matter, time, and their relation to sound and to the energy. And when the avant-gardes come, they just borrow from the already developed field of mass culture that is much more avant-garde and much more intermedia than what is happening within the fields of visual arts and music of the time. I just wanted to say that probably the importance of the time and of the space and of the energies of the experimental exhibitions from the 60s and even from the 20s and 30s has much more to do with how with all those so-called culture of attraction of the end of 19th century, with all the energetic mesmerism seances and different ghosts haunting rituals that are so popular in the last quarter of the 19th century. When we see how, when we look closely at the relation of the spectator, matter, and time, it's actually much more progressive and intermediate than what's happening in the within the official fields.
Well, was that addressed to me? Yeah.
Let me say, maybe to put it in a it's just a question, just an ask to expand the research outside the borders of the painting themselves and into the broader context of visual and sonic culture of the modernity.
Yeah. Well, a couple of things. There are many points of entry in response to what you just said, and the idea of the harmonia mundi, of course, you know, the cosmos was a zoon, as I said before, but it was also a musical harmony in the long tradition, as you say, into the 18th century, really until Newton, and then the musical people stopped hearing the music of but there was always a debate, and in the Renaissance there was a debate about whether or not thirds could be admitted to the discussion of harmony and used in the writing of music, and there was a real uneasiness, which I think has tremendous historical consequences about the narrow definitions of this Pythagorean system of music. Something that I've always thought and would like to, if I could have time to do it, think about is the importance of electricity and the importance of the kinds of imitation of consciousness that, I mean, we think about electricity in terms of the animation of things, but it's also an imitation of consciousness, and it's absolutely pervasive imitation of consciousness. And were there world enough in time, I would think about that a lot. In any case, this is producing what we call popular culture, the distinction between high culture and popular culture and all that. I mean, it really no longer exists. I mean, there's still, you can still go back and look at the equivalent of the Pythagorean, but as you seem to be suggesting, everything is going on, and there are all kinds of things. I mean, the definition of the artist as somebody who sort of acts in a significant way with peculiarly significant results in the modern world. There are just so many opportunities for this and so many realizations of this that it's difficult to appeal to anything like the old rules of music and the old rules of harmony. I would like to say one thing, though, and that is it's amazing how long these things like the harmony of the world lasted. I mean, we're talking talking about millennia, that basically this idea of the universe, of the cosmos, it existed until Newton, really.
I think maybe I won't use microphone to...
Oh.
Are you telling secrets?
Okay. Your presentation was titled Material Unbound, and mostly you focused on this unboundness in the sphere of nature. But you have mentioned a few words about this industrial era as well. And I'm very curious about your attitude on how the material was unbounded when the Industrial Revolution started and afterwards. I'm curious about your regulative categories to understand it and so on.
Well, that's a big question, but I think that to go back to that kind of perfect statement that Francis Bacon made about form and about the replacement of form by basically the energies that exist in things, that's a kind of prolegomena to the analysis of nature, and to thinking about nature in terms of natural resources, and to think about really taking nature apart and putting it back together again in useful ways, and making machines and making mills and producing objects that are only sort of metaphorically manufactured. The control of energy and nature as resource that is intimated, and not just in Bacon, but in all the earlier writers on science. That's the key to the transformation. I think that as you suggest, I said material unbound, and it's Prometheus unbound, but yeah, it has mixed results. The modern world is, we're all sitting here in the midst of what in historical terms would be the lap of luxury, as a result of these kinds of transformations of nature, and of giving form to nature. The transformation of nature. But is that an answer? Sort of.
Sort of.
Yeah. What would you?
I think that things radically changed after the invention of machines. Of course, we can somehow trace back different kind of machines back to the antiquity for sure. But in 18th and 19th century, the number of machines and its advanced increased very rapidly, and I think it. I'm just curious. What's your attitude on?
I'll say a little bit more about machines. Machines. The machine is from Meccani, and again, to go back to Aristotle, there's a pseudo-Aristotelian mechanics, and what he says mechanics is exactly when nature is not the way we want nature to be, we outwit nature, so to speak. To be Meccani or Meccanos was to be clever. Mechanics were people that used human ingenuity basically to correct nature for human purposes, and that's a very long tradition. And then the idea of the mechanical arts, and then there's a process that takes place through the late Middle Ages, through the Renaissance, and of the kind of incorporation of that kind of ingenuity into the structure of the human mind, taken all together. So, by the time you get to the say the Diderot's encyclopedia, you have all the mechanical, you have all the arts of mechanics incorporated into sort of human mental capability, and it's actually an enormous change because of a number of reasons. I think the difference between the modern machine and the ancient machine was the idea of force. That nature was something that could be translated into force. Like I said, you could burn the wood and heat the water and drive the engines and make the things that you made and make an industrial revolution. So the part of the analysis of nature and the exploitation of nature is still with fossil fuels and nuclear power. All of these things, these are foundational for modern life, and that is a real difference between ancient mechanics, which were basically kinds of skill, manual skill, and mechanism as the exploitation of natural material as power and as force.
May I? Last very brief.
Last one.
Finally, do you think that machines during the Industrial Revolutions has contributed somehow to unbonding material even more, or in the opposite way?
Well, I would say that comparing the whole thing to Prometheus was too optimistic, and the question of the unbinding of nature, and at the same time the exploitation of nature. What's created here again is a kind of dialectics, which again is very much afoot all in the world around us. We benefit from the exploitation of nature, and at the same time we feel at least uncomfortable about the exploitation of nature. But I think that in a way, the degendering of or the transformation, the sort of mythic transformation of the state of matter, I think is culturally very important. In a way that if there were world enough in time, we could connect with industrialization, but nothing is unmixed, I would say.
I stole the second microphone not only because we're slightly past our coffee time, but I wanted to sneak one more in, and we don't need to really discuss it. It's a thank you, because I think I heard you use the expression, you said collage, you called collage a delicate new media. And the Department of Intermedia wishes to express its gratitude for this. And it's actually, well, it's a little joke, but it relates to both your lectures. And it also relates to a conversation we had the day before yesterday when we were speaking about a certain dumbing down of reflection on the practitioner level. And we keep at least I have this feeling that we keep in academia, in fine arts, being pushed towards a really shallow definition of new media. I mean, I'm basically on a crusade against this term. It's one of the stupidest terms you could imagine, new media. It usually it's an alibi to introduce brainless technology in art academies. And both your lectures have a width that signals that there's more than new to media. There's more than new to all these relationships. We can discuss maybe this during coffee, but I think it's an interesting perspective. And my question, if we would have time for it, would be to what degree, in order to make a change, to construct an avant-garde, you actually need ignorance of these white perspectives as an ingredient. That was my question. But we don't need to prolong this moment. Thanks.